Hola, SAP developers. Welcome to this session, part of the TotalFest 2023 integration track. Before we start, please feel free to drop us your questions on the chat window, as we'll be monitoring it, and we will answer your questions then. Generative AI is everywhere nowadays. As developers, it is important for us to understand how these new developments in AI can be leveraged as part of the development process, right? And our integrations is part of our developments. So today we have Michael, who is the co-founder of Int4, an SAP partner, and will tell us about generative test-driven development for SAP cloud integration. Without any further delay, hola, Michael, over to you.
Hola. Hi, Antonio. Thank you so much for seeing us today, guys. Today, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the generative test-driven development, which is a new paradigm that is possible with different artificial intelligence products. But actually, ChatGPT was one of the first ones that we've tried with, and I will be showing you how we can leverage our SAP integration work together with this with the AI. My name is Michał Krawczyk. As Antonio mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Int4. Just maybe a few things about the company. Int4 AG, we're an SAP partner, and we're a market leader in test automation of SAP system integration. What we're trying to do is we're trying to deliver to customers solutions for testing their SAP integration, just to guarantee the continuity of their business. We also love to share our knowledge. We as Int4, we've published over 11 SAP Press books about different SAP integration topics. And we also have 2 open SAP trainings available for everyone for free. And we have over 11,000 participants that took part in both of in combined. But let me start with defining the main differences between the standard, the typical approach of doing SAP integration development and the new paradigm that we're constantly trying to improve. In a typical integration development cycle, we usually start like this. And please, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, or please post your questions also on the forum if what I'm saying is not right. So we usually start with a mapping specification in order to get to know how the integration is going to work between 2 different endpoints. We need to know how can they talk to each other. So we might need to do a mapping specification between an EDI or an XML, an IDOC, or JSON and JSON message. We need to, or someone also needs to help us with this mapping specification, because this can also come from a functional consultant. The second thing is that someone will be doing, usually a developer, an integration developer, will be responsible for developing the mapping. Once the mapping is complete, once the developer feels that the way how he understood the mapping specification is right, then we can start doing the testing. And again, please write me your comments on this, but usually when we start doing the testing, we can very quickly see that the mapping specification was not complete. So basically, we've only managed to do a few things right, but maybe the majority was actually either described in a way that we couldn't understand, that the developer couldn't understand, or maybe it wasn't there. Someone just forgot to put everything in the mapping specification. So actually, the test doesn't work. So what do we have to do? Of course, we have to go around, we have to go back to point number 1, B, C, and continue as often as long as someone will finally sign off the end-to-end test, which can take any point on time, but we will have to do this work multiple times. Is that also how you view your projects right now? Is that understood? Please also let me know. In the generative test-driven development, it works in a bit different way, because we do not have any manual mapping specifications. So how does that work? How can we design a mapping if we don't have any specifications? Actually, the mapping specification is something that we as humans would need to create from source and target messages. But why do we need to create the mapping specification if we can just use multiple source and target examples and ask AI to create the mapping specification, or create the actual mapping on its own? So the idea behind the generative test driven development is that at first, while we're starting designing the new mapping, we just have to get as many source and target messages as possible. We start with that. We can ask the source and target systems for that, or we can ask the functional consultants to prepare that. But we don't ask for the mapping specification. We don't need to do that. The next step, what we can do is we can take those messages and ask AI, any kind of LLM platform, so any kind of large language model that would supply this, that would allow us to do this, to generate the mapping automatically. And of course, we can do it directly from our solution, which is called Int4 Shield. And what we can also do is we want to make sure that we're not only generating the mapping, because as you know, AI can generate all sort of things, but they may not be true, right? What we need to make sure is that the mapping will actually work. So this is where we combine the different functionalities of Int4 solutions, where on one hand, we can generate the mapping, but on the other hand, we can validate whether the mapping is actually working, right? And then the last step is we just need to test the complete flow. And guess what? Step number C is actually we only need to run step number C once, because we've already tested the mapping with all of the possible source and target examples. So there are basically two main differences between the typical integration development cycle and the generative test-driven development. The first one is that we don't need to prepare the mapping specification, right? We would just be using source and target messages, so historical messages or maybe made-up messages, but real examples. The second thing is that where in the typical integration cycle, the developers usually don't have a lot of examples to do the testing. In case of the generative test-driven development, we already have all of the examples, so they can be run as often as possible. And this produces actually the complete working solution. The question is right now, if we understand how is this generative test-driven development working, when can we use this approach? So this is an important approach very often when we were starting to talk about the BTP Integration Suite migrations. I'm pretty sure most of you know that there is over 10,000 SAP PO customers that need to migrate to BTP Integration Suite, and many of them have technologies that are no longer supported on the Integration Suite, like for example ABAP mappings, or maybe some very complex EDI mappings, or any other even message mappings where there's no or limited documentation. How can we redo this mapping? How can we make sure that those mappings are not only working, but so for example, a typical case of a lift and shift migration, but we can actually edit them also on the Integration Suite. And this is where the generative test-driven development would work. The second use case is actually non-SAP integration platform migrations. So there's also a lot of customers who are thinking whether they should move from MuleSoft, Boomi, Web Methods, from those platforms to BTP Integration Suite. And again, in this case, maybe even we can move some of the mappings. Let's say the mapping in Web Methods or Boomi was done in XSLT. Maybe we can move it to the Integration Suite. But what if we don't have any kind of documentation for this mapping? So we don't even understand how can we change this mapping? Should we leave this mapping as it is? Or maybe should we try to redesign it so that we understand the rules of this mapping? As the last case is actually also very valid, because very often, and the case studies done by analytics companies are saying that usually around 2 to 3 years, the company's SAP customers are usually changing service integrators. If we do not use the generative test-driven approach for developing our integration, we may lose the knowledge how was the integration done when the service integrator is gone. Did anyone have a case like this? Please tell me if this is also relevant for your cases. So these are the three biggest use cases. But let's concentrate on the first one, because I think that the SAP PO to SAP Integration Suite migrations will be the biggest case for those for the use of generative test-driven development. As we know, and this was already highlighted by SAP, that the shift and lift migrations, if we use any kind of automated migration tools, they actually fail to capitalize on the opportunities that we get from the new integration platforms. And what are the examples of that? So let's imagine that we migrate all of our even message mappings. What if those message mappings have 20 user-defined functions in it? How are we going to maintain this on the integration suite? Do we really want to do this like this? Or maybe should we change this a little bit using generative test-driven development approach? Especially that we have a perfect opportunity, because we can fetch hundreds or thousands of messages, historical messages, from the SAP PO production system. For example, using our solution. What about migration? Do we want to migrate CC-BPMs or even BPMs? Or do we want to redesign the flow from scratch? Another case, RFC, SOAP, or JDBC lookups. Do we really want to have them also within the user-defined functions inside the integration suite? How can we redesign this, right? So there are a few cases which would say it doesn't mean that we should not doing a lift and shift approach. What it basically means is that we don't have to do it for all of our integrations. So we need to use some sort of a mix. And very often we at Int4 we call this mix a blue lift and shift, where what you can do if you want to migrate, there's a few cases that you can have a look at. Like, for example, use prepackaged content. There is a lot of prepackaged content coming from SAP, and you can do this to eliminate custom integration flows. Right? There's no need to do a lift and shift if a prepackaged content already exists. And this prepackaged content will be automatically updated either by SAP or one of the partners. So you do not need to redesign this, even if you develop this in some very strange technology. Then we can also use some new frameworks, like, for example, Mach frameworks. If you're thinking about using Event Broker or Event Mesh, this is something you should have a look at, right? If you want your flows to be decoupled, if you want to make sure that your flows are working on the event-based principles, this is the time to do it. And the last one, which is mentioned here as the first step, is we can also change the mappings. We can also re-implement our very, very complex message mappings. We can change our Java mappings and ABAP mappings, for example, to Groovy, right? Or we can change all of them to XSLT. But the question is, how do we do it in an effective way? And one of the answers to that is using the generative test-driven development, because this is already possible. We can already do that. And I will be showing you some of the concepts that we're using for creating that. Why should you use Int4 Shield for this purpose? This is where our partnership with SAP comes in. So for those of you that don't know, during last year's SAP TechEd, Jürgen Miller, SAP CTO, announced that Int4 Shield Lite can be used for free for 12 months for any partner who would be migrating from SAP PO to SAP BTP Integration Suite. So we're not only a recommended solution by SAP for accelerating the migration from SAP PO to SAP Integration Suite, also using the blue shift and lift approach, but we're also the only partner solution used by SAP as an OEM solution. Actually, there is a new as of the second quarter of this year of 2023. There is a new RISE with SAP service called SAP Integration Suite Testing, and SAP is using Int4 solutions for running this service. So our solution is not only recommended but also used by SAP. But maybe let's get down to the real meat, right? So I will show you how does it work in reality, because this is what the developers are interested in. So let me now open Int4 Shield. So let me show you how we can do the generative test driven development directly from Int4 Shield, which is a part of Int4 Suite. So this is our labs preview. So I will just describe the solution, how it's working, and later on I will also tell you a little bit more what our product management team is actually up to in the new editions. So what I've told you is that before we start doing the generative test driven development, at first we need to have some historical messages. So we can actually take those messages directly from Int4 Shield, because what Int4 Shield allows us to do is to fetch all of your messages, for example, for a single day or for a single week, from your SAP PO production environment. So we have a special robotic crawler that would go to your SAP PO and fetch as many messages as you want, and would store them in a form of test cases. So one test case would actually be a pair of source and target messages. In this case, I'm selecting one of the test cases, and I can actually see what are the messages inside. And I've got two messages. One of them is an XML purchase order, which I have here, and I need to map it to an IDOC. And this I don't have the mapping here. I just have the source and target messages. And what I will try to do right now with the use of generative test-driven development, I will try to generate the mapping using ChatGPT. So what I can do here is I can click on Submit. And right now, what Int4 Shield will do is it will send those messages to AI, to ChatGPT, and will ask, can you please create the mapping? This is the first step. Once we get the mapping created, of course, we need to be able to validate this mapping to see if the mapping was prepared in a correct way. And once we do that for all of the test cases, then we know that our mapping will be working for sure. So we can go and test it for the end-to-end purposes. Yes. So right now, what we ask for, we've actually asked for an XSLT mapping. The XSLT mapping was generated here. So we have an XSLT mapping that we can use. And this is the mapping that is supposed to change this XML document into an IDOC document. What I can do directly from Int4 Shield is I can also create an integration suite flow directly from this. So I just need to click here, and this would create a test case for those two messages, which is 554. But it would actually also deploy a working integration flow on my BTP Integration Suite tenant, where this mapping would be automatically injected. So what I can do right now is I can go and check the main functionality of the Shield, which is the tester cockpit. I need to find my test scenario. which was 554. So this is the scenario. And what I can do is right now I can validate whether the ChatGPT created a correct mapping, right? So what I can do is I can execute this test. And by executing this test, what I'm doing right now is actually Int4 Shield is sending the source message again, and it will validate the new output. It will compare the new output with the old output from the old test from the SAP PO, and we will be able to see the differences. What are the differences between those two messages? Because please remember, AI will not validate the mapping on its own, right? AI doesn't know that. AI is just proposing a solution, but we always need to check whether the solution is actually working, whether it's good. So it takes a few seconds for the job to be run. It should refresh automatically. So right now, Int4 Shield is collecting the results of the first mapping, and what we can see is that the run actually failed. So let's have a look what failed. We can see some technical details about the run. So what was the integration flow? We can directly go to the integration flow. Yes, and we can see what is the result of the mapping of the current execution, and we can compare this with the reference message. We see that there is an issue here at the namespace level, but actually all of the fields, they're mapped correctly. So AI, even in the first run, it gave us a correct mapping, right? Of course, we may need to work on this a little bit more, and I will tell you a little bit how we're thinking, how we can implement those changes also. But the mapping was completely generated by any kind of specially designed large language model, which in this case is ChatGPT, just for the purpose of this exercise, right? But of course, we can switch this to any other LLM. And how much time did it take to create this mapping? It took nothing, right? It was just a few seconds, because I could grab the historical messages from the existing platform, SAP Process Orchestration from the production, and I could just ask the artificial intelligence to generate the mapping. So basically, my approach is bulletproof, because I not only save the time on creating the mapping, but I also validated this mapping, right? And of course, as you can see, the mapping still failed. So what we need to do is we need to go to this mapping, go to the XSLT mapping, and we have two choices. We can either correct it manually, or we can continue working with chat, with AI model, telling him, okay, this actually did not work. This piece did not work. So what we're doing currently at Int4 is we're going a step further with this. We're working on our own large language model that will be able to, again, grab the historical messages, but it will be able to create fully complete message mappings, or actually any kind of mappings, because in BTP Integration Suite, in most cases, this would be Groovy mappings or XSLT mappings, right? We're all fans of Groovy, so in most cases we would obviously like to have a Groovy mapping from this. What our product team is working on right now is that from those historical messages, again, without having any kind of mapping specification, we would be able to create the mapping and validate the mappings for all of the messages. And the execution of the testing can be run at any time, right? So this is also the test-driven development. The old test-driven development approach, for those of you that do not know this term, always started with defining the end criteria at the beginning. So not to start with a mapping specification, but start with defining the end result. So for example, having target message from the source message. And the generative test-driven development goes a step further, because of course you still have to have the source and target messages, but which is pretty easy for integration platform migrations, because we can just take the old messages, the historical messages from any kind of platform, be it SAP Process Orchestration or MuleSoft or Web Methods or Boomi. But we can also automatically generate the mapping. And if anything changes in the mapping, we can again just supply a little bit more of those source and target message pairs, and again regenerate the mapping. So we're not only talking about the migration itself, but also on the BAU, business as usual part. Because after you do the migration, you want to be able to say, okay, we did the migration, but now we can actually change some of those things as well, right? So this is also the important the thing you may need to have a look at. Yes, and having said that, this brings us to the what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you the idea, the long-term vision for this generative test-driven development. And I would really like to hear your comments that you can put on the chat, so that we know a little bit more. How do you feel about this? Or how do you feel about ChatGPT use for the purpose of developing integration flows and BTP Integration Suite at all? Having said that, I'll be waiting for your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them on the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was very interesting seeing how it automatically generated that mapping for you, right? I have a couple of questions, and I can see, for example, the huge value that this process adds in a migration scenario, right, where we're trying to move those using that historical data in order to create that mapping from your source and target messages. But what about a new interface? So, for example, something that you're developing from scratch. You don't have the, and I imagine the scenario like, okay, this will be our source message, right? And you sort of can sort of mock target messages as well. Yeah. So would it be possible to, I don't know, provide this as an input to Int4 as well, and yes, so that it can generate that? Okay.
So for new mappings, so for completely new integration flows, it works exactly in the same way. So the only difference is that instead of asking usually the functional consultant or the people who are working with different systems, with integrations or different systems, you don't ask them to give you a mapping specification. Because the problem with mapping specification is that we do not speak the same language. Even though the project language might be English, it's still the mapping rules might be so complex that no one will understand them. So it's very difficult to have different sort of mapping rules designed or described even by different people on the same project and implement them in the same way. What AI gives us in this case is that we can get rid of this, because we just say, okay, tell me what is the source and what is the target. Design as many examples as you can, how you think that those messages should look like. And I don't need to know the mapping specification. I will just make sure that I have a mapping. And the second thing is, and that I can change the mapping later on, right? Because this is also important. So I don't need to have a developer that would be able to read all mapping specifications, because I don't think such a developer does not exist. But I will be able to say, if my mapping changed, I just supply a few more test cases, source and target pairs, and I just say one more time, rerun this mapping. Rerun this as much as possible, so that finally I have a version that is working with all of my messages. And the beauty with integration is that I can have thousands of messages in reality, right? I can have I can ask the sender system, hey, why don't you give me 100 messages? I can ask the receiver, can you give me the 100 messages that are designed for those? Yeah, sure. Okay, let's design the mapping automatically. So I will also not miss the examples that are never described in the specification. The specifications are only, the mapping is only as good as the specifications, but in reality, the specifications are just not good, right?
Yeah.
So this is the issue we're trying to solve. We don't want a specification. We just want to know, like in test-driven development, we want to know what is the end result, source and target.
Great. So I noticed in your demo that somewhere it said that it was a labs preview.
Yes.
So when should we expect something like this to be available? I guess because that's in everyone's mind now. Like, I really like it. I can test it. So
yes. So currently our team is putting a lot of effort on that, but we don't have any specific days because we're working on as we mentioned, we're working on our own large language model. We think that the ChatGPT is not a solution that can work for everything. We want to have our own solution for doing that. But unfortunately, currently we cannot tell you the exact dates where this will be available. But this is I would say we're putting a lot of effort into this because this is so much integrated into our testing solution, right? Our testing solution is just doing validation of all of the interfaces, of all of the integration scenarios. So for this purpose, is actually the best kind of use case to use it also for development, for validating the AI developments. Let's put it like this.
Yeah. Well, if you're developing your own large language model, then it makes sense that it might take a bit more time. But then that final model will end up being a lot more robust than using something generic, which is still good, but you would expect it to be much better, right? If you end up developing that. So, well, you know what? Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this session. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for joining the live event or the recording. So there is plenty for everyone to learn during the TOEFest. So make sure to check out all the sessions that are part of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anton. Thank you, guys.